Lonely Lumberjack bought a woman sold by her father, unaware she carried a miracle he'd prayed for. What kind of man would pay $50 for a stranger's daughter in the middle of a snowy marketplace, only to say, "This isn't a purchase, it's a promise"? In 1847 Oregon, a lonely lumberjack named Jonas hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. But when he saw a young woman being auctioned by her own father, something inside him broke, and something else quietly awakened. He didn't know her name, he didn't know her past, and he certainly didn't know that beneath her silence, she carried the very miracle he had prayed for every night for 17 years. This is not just a story about a man who saved a woman. It's about two broken people, stranded at the edges of the world, who chose to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. And what happens when the past tries to claim what's no longer his? Comment below with the part of this story that touched you the most. And if you love storytelling with heart, don't forget to like and subscribe. He hadn't heard his name in years. Not since the last letter stopped coming. Not since he'd watched the world fade behind him as he rode deeper into the Oregon woods, carrying only an axe, a worn-out Bible, and a silence that grew heavier with each season. Jonas Whitmore lived alone in a cabin that creaked more than it breathed. The wind whispered through the pines but never answered. The river ran endlessly past his porch, yet carried no news. Day after day he split logs with the same rhythm, the same force, as if the trees might one day respond. He wasn't angry, just missing. Like a page torn from a book no one noticed was gone. Each night he lit the lantern in the window, not out of habit but hope. That somewhere out there, a soul just as lost might see it and remember what it felt like to be wanted. He didn't pray with words. His prayers were quieter than that, folded into the steam of his breath, into the scrape of wood, into the last log placed on the fire. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that he was still waiting. The market that morning was ordinary in every way that made it forgettable. Chickens squawked, boots scraped over packed dirt, and men haggled over flour, nails, and whiskey like they did every other week. Jonas Whitmore didn't come for company. He came for salt, maybe a spool of thread, and to remind himself the world still moved while he stood still. But today, something made the air different, still and sharp, like just before a storm. He noticed it in the silence, in the way heads turned but no one laughed. A small crowd had gathered near the far end, not around a stall but around a man, one of their own. He stood tall, mean-eyed, coat hanging open like pride. And next to him a girl. Her hair was dark, her dress thin and road-worn. She stood perfectly still, arms at her sides, looking past everyone like she'd trained herself to see nothing. The man raised his voice. "This here's Sarah, 17. Been trouble, but she can cook and clean when she listens. Ain't good with talkin', but she's healthy, real healthy. $40 starts it off, 50 if you're serious." No one laughed, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know if it would make them complicit. A few turned away. A woman gasped, "That's his daughter," in a voice half whisper, half prayer, but no one moved to stop it. Sarah didn't cry, didn't blink. Just stood there like she'd done this before, or worse, like she'd expected this all along. Jonas had been a quiet man most of his life, but there are moments when silence feels like betrayal, when stillness becomes surrender. He walked forward, slowly, deliberately, boots crunching the earth that suddenly seemed too loud. The crowd parted without a word. He looked at Sarah, not her face, not at first. He looked at her hands, small, clenched, blue from cold. Not fear, resignation. Then gently he raised his eyes and she looked back. $60, Jonas said. His voice didn't rise above the wind, but it cut through. The man sneered, already reaching for the money. Told you she was worth more. Let's. Not to buy her, Jonas said. To marry her if she agrees. You could have heard a pine needle drop. Even the wind paused to listen. What? The father spat. I'm not buying livestock, Jonas said, still looking only at Sarah. I'm offering her something she should have been given from the start. A choice. Sarah blinked, just once, then again like someone waking up. No papers, no priest, nothing official, the father barked. You can't just. I can, Jonas said. If she says yes. Sarah didn't move for a long time. Then slowly she nodded. Not because she trusted him, not because she believed in miracles, but because she was tired of being owned. And Jonas, he didn't take her hand, didn't lead her away. He simply stepped aside, turned his shoulder, and waited to see if she would walk with him. She did, and behind them the market resumed. Boots scuffed, chickens clucked. The world, as it often does, turned away from the thing it didn't want to confront. But two souls had shifted that day, not through love, not yet, but through defiance, and the quiet beginning of something neither of them knew how to name. The cabin had stood for 3 winters, but it had never felt inhabited. Jonas had built it by hand, every beam, every nail, every stubborn corner that wouldn't square. It kept the cold out mostly, kept the rain off his bed. But it had never truly kept him company, until Sarah stepped inside. She didn't speak when he pushed the door open for her. She walked in slow, like someone testing the floor of a church she didn't believe in. Her eyes moved across the rough-hewn table, the stone hearth, the single chair. Then to the empty cradle in the corner, unfinished, dusty, and untouched. She said nothing, but something in her breath shifted, and something in the room did too. Jonas didn't show her where to sleep. He didn't tell her what to do. He simply left her by the fire, placed a folded blanket on the bench, and returned to his chopping block outside. The axe bit wood, and for the first time in years, there was another sound in his silence. The creak of floorboards behind him, the clang of iron as she tested the old skillet, the hush of broom bristles sweeping away seasons of forgotten dust. She didn't ask him why he had a cradle with no child. He didn't ask her why she flinched whenever footsteps passed the cabin. That night she made soup, too salty, but warm. Jonas ate in quiet gratitude, and when she cleared the bowls, he finally spoke. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice barely above the fire. "I meant what I said back there. You're free. If this place doesn't feel like somewhere you want to be, I'll help you find where does." Sarah didn't answer right away. She sat down across from him, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. Her eyes didn't rise. "I'm pregnant," she said, 3 words. No tremble, no apology. Jonas blinked once. She waited for the recoil, the shift in his face. She'd seen it before, men who saw a burden, not a child. But Jonas didn't look away. He looked at her, then to the fire, then back again. "It's not the baby's fault how it came to be," she added, more to herself than to him. Jonas nodded slowly. "I figured," he said. Sarah frowned. "You knew." "No, but I suspected," he said. "You hold your middle when you think no one's looking." A beat passed. Then she laughed, soft, dry, surprised. And maybe for the first time in months, real. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said. "You've already done more than anyone else." "I'm not offering charity," Jonas said. "This cabin's been waiting a long..." Winter in Oregon didn't announce itself. It crept in like an unwelcome guest, quiet, sharp, and unrelenting. The first frost came in late October, dusting the windows in white. By November, the world outside the cabin had turned to ice and silence. Inside, things were different. Jonas reinforced the windows with extra canvas. He chopped and stacked firewood until the back wall of the cabin looked like it was built from trees alone. Sarah mended blankets, stitched tiny sleeves into old flannel, and boiled water over the fire like it was a ritual. The cabin no longer echoed. It breathed. They didn't speak much about the baby, not directly. But everything they did was in orbit around that quiet center. Jonas spent 2 days sanding the cradle he'd never finished. He added a carved bird to the headboard, though he never explained why. "Blue jay," Sarah said softly when she saw it. "My mother loved them." He nodded, pretending that had been the plan all along. Sometimes at night she'd wake to find him sitting by the fire, whittling. She wouldn't interrupt. He wasn't building anything, just shaping wood. As if he needed his hands busy to keep his fears still. One evening, as wind howled like wolves outside, Sarah sat near the hearth, her fingers wrapped around a cup of broth. Her eyes followed the flames, unfocused. Then suddenly she winced. Jonas was beside her before she could speak. "Are you?" She reached for his hand, silent, and placed it gently on her belly. There, a nudge, then another. Quick, soft, and certain. Jonas stared like he'd never touched life before. "She kicks more when there's music," Sarah whispered. "Or when I'm nervous." He looked at her but said nothing. Then, after a moment, "I just feel it," she said, smiling faintly. "I don't know why." He nodded. "She's strong." Sarah's smile wavered. "Not like me." Jonas leaned back, still watching the fire. "Strong isn't loud," he said. "Sometimes it's just staying put when the wind says run." She didn't answer, but she stayed close. That night, Sarah told him about the man she had once trusted, about the promises, the shame, and the moment she realized she had been left not just alone, but labeled, blamed, and expected to carry it quietly. Jonas didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't offer anger or pity. Instead, the next morning she woke to find a coat hung beside the door. Not hers, a new one, lined with wool, stitched by hand. Inside the pocket, a small note. For the walk between what was. Motherhood didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, stitched, whittled, gathered, and learned in silence. Sarah never said, "I'm preparing." She simply began. One morning she stood barefoot by the window, holding one of Jonas's old shirts. It was too worn to repair, but she turned it over in her hands like it still had value. Then she began cutting. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. She turned that shirt into a sleeping gown. The sleeves became booties. The collar, carefully picked apart, became the edging for a tiny cap. When she finished, she placed it all in the cradle with a reverence usually reserved for church altars. Jonas watched from the doorway. He said nothing. But that night he left a spool of blue thread and a stronger needle on the table beside her bowl. There were no doctors out here, no women to teach her what to expect. So Sarah did what frontier women had always done. She prepared without ceremony. She learned how to start the fire when her hands were shaking. She carried buckets of snow to melt for washing. She practiced breathing slowly when the baby shifted too hard against her ribs. And in the evenings, when the chores were done and Jonas had gone quiet in the corner, she would take a bit of charred wood and write, just a few lines on a piece of pine. Not for anyone else, not even for the baby. Just to remind herself she still had a voice. One night she carved a name, Grace, not because she knew, but because it felt right, like something had been restored. She tucked the wooden slat beneath the cradle and never spoke of it. Jonas, for his part, stayed near, but not too near. He didn't hover. He didn't offer advice. He split more wood than usual, mended tools that didn't need mending, built a small bench for outside the cabin, even though snow had already begun to fall. It wasn't avoidance. It was space. The kind a man gives when he's learning how not to take up too much. Then one morning, as Sarah struggled with a frozen latch on the barn door, Jonas stepped up behind her and said, "Use your elbow. Warms it quicker than fingers." She tried, it worked, and for the first time she laughed. Not the tight, polite kind, but real laughter, brief and surprised. That night as they sat by the fire, the baby kicked again, stronger this time. Sarah gasped and grabbed Jonas's hand. "Feel that?" she whispered. He did. And for a moment neither of them moved. Then, to Sarah's amazement, he grinned, like a boy catching his first fish, and said, "Guess she liked the soup." Sarah shook her head, smiling. "I think she likes the quiet," she said. "She knows it means we're safe." Jonas didn't answer, but he reached for another log, placed it gently in the fire, and sat closer than he had before. And in the hush between flame and snowfall, two people who had once been strangers quietly became a family. Not through declaration, but through the... They came just after first light. 3 men on horseback, their breath turning white in the cold, their jackets still dusted with sawdust from the lumber camp downriver. Jonas saw them before they knocked. He always did, and didn't move from where he was splitting wood by the shed. Instead, he finished the log in front of him, stacked it neatly, and walked inside to put the kettle on. He knew why they were here. The knock was polite, almost rehearsed. One of the men, Tom Haver, who used to share fence tools back in the early days, removed his hat when Jonas opened the door. "Mind if we step in a minute?" he asked. Jonas didn't answer. He stepped aside. The 3 men entered like people unsure if they were in the right, but too proud to turn around. Their eyes swept the room, clean, warm, lived in. Sarah wasn't there. She'd gone to fetch herbs with a neighbor's wife that morning. "Nice place," Tom muttered. "Didn't think you'd stay this long." Jonas poured tea into 4 mismatched mugs. He didn't ask if they wanted any. The oldest of the men, a gruff one named Will, cleared his throat. "We heard about the girl." Jonas didn't look up. "No one's judging," Will added quickly. "We just figured someone ought to say something. She ain't your wife. Folks talk." "They always do," Jonas said, calm. "She's not from here, doesn't belong to anyone. You take her in, you make her your problem. Might cost you your place at the mill come spring." Jonas finally looked up. "She's not a problem," he said. "She's a person." Tom shifted in his seat. "No one's saying she is. But you've been good to this town. Built your cabin, paid your dues. Don't throw it away for someone who might not stay." Jonas set the kettle back on the stove with a soft clang. "She's already stayed," he said. There was silence, the kind that follows something final. The third man, young, nervous, maybe sent along for muscle, opened his mouth, then closed it. Jonas poured the last cup, slid it toward them, then sat down without touching his own. "You boys rode out here early," he said. "Means you thought it was important. So I'll say this once. I know who I am. I know who she is. And if anyone thinks that makes me less of a man or less welcome in town, they can stop drinking my tea and ride on." Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Will gave a single nod, slow and heavy. "Didn't mean offense," he muttered. "None taken," Jonas replied. "You came to say your piece. Now you've said it." He stood not as a threat but as closure. The men followed him to the door, boots heavy on the wood floor. Before stepping outside, Tom glanced back once. "She's lucky," he said, "to have someone willing to stand in the middle of all this with her." Jonas didn't smile, but he didn't shut the door fast either. "She's not lucky," he said. "She's just finally somewhere she doesn't have to." Acceptance didn't come with apologies. It came with a loaf of bread. Jonas found it one morning just outside the door, still warm, wrapped in linen, resting on the flat rock he used for splitting kindling. No note, no name. Just the quiet weight of kindness left behind by someone who couldn't yet say it aloud. He stood there, staring at it, steam rising in the dawn chill like a small offering to a god of second chances. Sarah, still sleepy, stepped beside him. "You expecting someone?" "No," he said, "but maybe someone's done expecting the worst." They brought the bread inside. It tasted of molasses and cloves, simple, heavy, generous. Sarah said nothing more. But later that day, she washed the linen and folded it neatly by the door in case whoever left it came back. A few days later, while Jonas was chopping wood, he heard laughter, children's voices, high and unfiltered. He turned to see two boys tumbling down the snowbank near the cabin, shouting, throwing handfuls of powder at each other. Sarah stepped outside, cradling a bowl of soup. She watched them quietly, her hand resting on the roundness beneath her coat. One of the boys looked up and waved, not out of obligation, just waved. Sarah blinked, surprised, then raised her hand and waved back, tentative but steady. Neither child ran. Jonas watched it all from the corner of his eye, never stopping his work but taking it in. The sound of play, the absence of stares, the shifting air. A week later at the trading post, a man Jonas barely knew, an older farmer named Dent, paused as Jonas passed. He didn't speak, just gave a small nod, brief, measured, but real. That nod, Jonas realized, said more than any blessing could. It said, "We see you. We're not ready to say everything, but we no longer say nothing. Back at the cabin, Sarah had begun planting dried herbs in old tins. She hummed sometimes now, mostly while stirring stew. Jonas didn't ask what song it was. He just let it fill the space between them. At night, the fire still burned. But it no longer felt like defense. It felt like welcome. Acceptance, Jonas learned, didn't always ride in on words. Sometimes it arrived in gestures. It began like any other trip into town. The snow had started melting in strips along the road, leaving behind patches of wet earth and the occasional glint of rock. Sarah wore the blue shawl she had sewn from leftover fabric, her belly round beneath it. She held Jonas's arm, not tightly, not possessively, just resting there like the gesture had grown into them over time. Jonas never liked town, but he went because he needed to. Nails, oil, salt, a new blade for the axe. Sarah asked if she could come. She wanted to see colors, she said. Maybe find a ribbon for the cradle. They weren't in the general store more than 10 minutes when Jonas noticed the silence shift, like a room inhaling. Then came the voice. "Well, well, didn't expect to see you standing so tall, Sarah girl." Jonas stiffened. Sarah didn't move. The voice came again, slurred at the edges, soaked in something bitter and familiar. William McKenna, her father. The man who had sold her in the square with the same tone someone might use to auction livestock. He stood in the doorway, face red from drink, eyes scanning Sarah like a claim he'd forgotten he lost. "You walkin' like you belong now." He barked. "You think that dress and that belly make you a wife." Jonas stepped forward, blocking her view. "You need to leave," he said, low and steady. William chuckled, ugly and slow. "She's carrying some other man's mistake, and you're wearing it like a badge." He took a step forward. Jonas didn't flinch. "This town used to respect you," William spat. "Now they see you playing house with a ruined girl and her bastard child." Then came the thing no one expected. Sarah stepped around Jonas, not timid, not unsure. She moved with the kind of quiet that comes only after surviving something loud. "You don't get to call me ruined," she said. The air dropped. "You gave up that right the day you counted out my worth in front of strangers. You broke me once. You don't get to name what I became after." William laughed, but it was hollow now. He glanced at the onlookers, hoping for smirks, nods, something to lean on, but no one moved. The blacksmith pretended to polish a hinge. A woman behind the dry goods counter stood frozen, cloth in hand. A child clutched her mother's apron, eyes wide, unblinking. Sarah took one more step. "I am not yours," she said. "I don't belong to anyone, but I was offered a home and I chose it." William's face twisted, part rage, part confusion. "He bought you." "No," she said. "He offered me freedom. I made it a life." He looked to Jonas now, desperate. "You gonna let her speak to her own kin like that?" Jonas didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the town had answered for him with their silence, with the weight of their stillness, with the lack of anyone stepping in to defend a man who had once shouted over everyone else. Sarah turned. "You can leave now," she said. William lingered for one breath too long. Then he spat near the dirt by her feet, not quite at her but close, and staggered away down the alley behind the stable. No one followed. No one stopped him. After a long moment, Jonas exhaled. Sarah didn't cry, didn't shake. She just turned back toward the shop and said, "I still need thread, blue if they have it." Jonas followed her inside. Later that day, they walked home through the snow-mudded path. At one point, he reached for her hand, but she had already taken his, not as protection, as equal footing. And that night, after the fire was stoked and the wind curled soft against the windows, Sarah opened the drawer beside the cradle and placed a single blue ribbon inside. Not to remember the man. The snow began softly that night, as if it, too, was holding its breath. Jonas had noticed the shift in the air around dusk, the way the clouds thickened low, the cold growing heavy enough to press against the windows like a visitor. He added 2 more logs to the fire, checked the shutters, and placed an extra blanket at the foot of the bed. Sarah moved slower now, every step deliberate. She didn't complain, didn't groan, but he could see it in her eyes, the weight of waiting. She stood in front of the cradle, hand resting gently on the wood Jonas had carved weeks ago. The firelight danced across her face as she leaned forward, holding a small piece of charcoal, and began to write. Grace. She didn't ask if it was the right name, didn't hesitate, as if the letters had already been written somewhere else long ago and she was simply copying them down from memory. Jonas watched from across the room. He didn't interrupt. He waited until she stood and went to warm tea before walking over. His fingers traced the faint lines she'd drawn, then reached for the small chisel he kept tucked behind the shelf. It took longer than he thought. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but he worked slowly, with care, with reverence. By the time he finished carving the name, Sarah had returned and sat silently beside him, watching. She didn't speak, just ran her fingers over the letters once they were done. "Grace," she whispered. Jonas nodded. "Seems right." Later they sat by the window, mugs of warm tea between them, snow falling in thick layers against the dark. The world outside was quiet in the way that only comes before something life-changing. Sarah cradled her belly with both hands, then looked up. "Do you think we're ready?" she asked. Jonas smiled faintly. "No one ever is." She chuckled, tired, honest. "That's what I figured." They fell into silence again. "I might be alone when it happens," she said suddenly. "It might come fast. You might be out chopping or hauling snow." He didn't flinch, just turned his head. "I won't be," he said. She looked at him. "You can't promise that." "I can promise I'll try," he replied. "More than I've tried for anything." She looked down at the cup in her hands. "I'm not scared of the pain," she said quietly. "I'm scared of being alone." Jonas didn't speak right away. He reached out and took her hand, rough fingers closing around hers. "You're not alone," he said. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not after." The wind picked up, rattling the shutters, but the fire held. The warmth between them didn't waver. They didn't speak again for a long time. And when they finally went to bed, Sarah lay awake beside him, watching the ceiling, feeling the baby shift like a tide beneath her ribs. At some point in the night, she reached for his hand and placed it gently over her belly. And without word, it began just before dawn, when the wind was at its fiercest, and the world outside the cabin had vanished beneath snow. Jonas had been up since before light, boiling water, checking firewood, pacing without purpose. Something in the air had shifted, too still, too heavy. He didn't need a clock to know the day had turned. Something deeper told him it was time. Sarah's first sound was not a scream, not even a cry, just a soft intake of breath, sharp and certain, like someone bracing for a storm. Jonas turned, saw her gripping the table with white knuckles, her face taut, eyes wide. "It's starting," she whispered. Jonas moved before his mind caught up. Blankets, towels, kettle, the chair by the fire. Everything he had rehearsed in his head for weeks, now trembling in his hands. He'd imagined he'd have help. A neighbor, maybe. A midwife. But the snow had sealed them in. No one was coming. He looked at Sarah, pale, sweating already. She met his eyes, fierce and afraid. "Don't leave me," she said. "Never." The next hours blurred. Jonas kept the fire high, though his own breath fogged in front of his lips. He held her hand when she let him, wiped her brow when she closed her eyes. Her pain came in waves, unforgiving, endless. She bit her lip until it bled. He whispered prayers without words, fingers tightening around hers each time she cried out. "I can't," she said once, her voice cracking. "You already are," he replied, gripping her hand tighter. At one point he lost track of time entirely. The world became only the room, the heat, the snow-streaked windows, the sound of Sarah's breath fighting the dark. He watched her body bend to a pain he couldn't comprehend, and still she didn't give in. Then, suddenly, terrifyingly, stillness. Sarah's body collapsed back against the chair, chest heaving. Jonas panicked. "Sarah," he whispered, leaning close. "Stay with me, please." She nodded faintly. "One more." And then she pushed. The moment felt too large, too fragile. Jonas's hands trembled as he reached forward, unsure, terrified, but unwilling to let go. And then it happened. A cry, faint, high-pitched, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. He stared down at the tiny life in his hands, slick and writhing, eyes squeezed shut against the firelight. He had never seen anything so small, so loud, so real. Sarah sobbed, not from pain but from release, from something she'd been holding for too long. Jonas wrapped the child in the blanket Sarah had sewn from his shirt. He placed her on Sarah's chest, hands still shaking. "She's here," he whispered. Sarah opened her eyes, lips trembling. "She's perfect." Jonas sat beside her, resting his forehead against her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Outside, the wind began to die. Inside, the fire dimmed but held. And the child, Grace, let out one more small sound. Not a cry this time, something softer, like a breath being borrowed by someone new to the world. The morning after the longest night came quietly, with the kind of light that doesn't announce itself, just creeps across the floorboards, soft and golden, like it knows the house has been through something holy. Sarah lay still, pale but peaceful, one hand curled around the bundle on her chest. The baby, barely more than a whisper wrapped in flannel, slept with her mouth parted slightly, her tiny fist pressed against her mother's collarbone like an anchor. Jonas sat close, his hand resting lightly on Sarah's arm. He hadn't slept, but he didn't feel tired, only full, stretched thin in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with awe. For a long while none of them moved. The fire had settled into coals. The wind outside had softened into stillness. The storm had passed. Sarah opened her eyes slowly, blinked, then looked down. "She looks like you," she murmured. Jonas shook his head. "She looks like someone new." They sat in silence again, listening to the soft breath of the child between them. Finally, Sarah said it aloud. "Her name is Grace." Jonas nodded once. "It always was." She turned toward him, surprised. "You knew." "I felt it," he said. "Not when she was born, before, when you carved it. It felt like a promise." Sarah smiled faintly. "Not a name we earned." "No," he agreed. "A name we were given anyway." Outside, the snow had begun to melt in patches along the edges of the roof. Tiny drops slid down the eaves and hit the ground like the ticking of a soft new clock. Jonas stood, stretched slowly, then walked to the cradle. He placed the carved panel Grace back where it belonged, not as a wish, as truth. When he turned, Sarah was watching him. "We made it," she said. He walked back to her, sat down, reached for the baby's tiny hand. "No," he said gently, "we're just beginning." She rested her head against his shoulder. "And the cabin, once a..." Jonas used to believe God had forgotten his name. For years, he spoke to the trees, the wind, the sky, never sure anyone was listening. He thought maybe he wasn't meant for anything more than swinging an axe in silence, eating alone and going unnoticed. But now, as he watched Sarah sleep with Grace in her arms, as the morning light kissed the wooden cradle with the name they had both chosen, he understood something different. Maybe the miracle wasn't something that descended from above. Maybe it was what happened when you stayed, when you didn't walk away, when you chose again and again to remain, even when it was easier not to. Jonas hadn't been given a family. He had become one. And in the quiet of that truth, beneath a roof built by his own two hands, he found what he'd been praying for all along, not because it arrived like thunder, but because he had finally become still enough to receive it. He reached for another log, placed it on the fire, no longer for warmth, but for the life they were building, one breath, one night, one quiet act of love at a time. Comment below which part of their journey moved you the most. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, don't forget to like and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales.